When we are young, we read novels to find out about the world. They are our maps and our guides to the unknown. Through reading fiction, we chart our way through time and place, and through manners and morals, extending our grasp of our immediate neighbourhood, suburban Sheffield, a London borough, a Scottish village, a Welsh valley, an Indian city, to explore other lives and other places, some almost unimaginably different from our own. We learn our way round Lyme Regis and Bath, round Middlemarch in Middle England, round Egdon Heath and Edinburgh and Paris, and St. Petersburg and Chicago and Manhattan. Some of these places come to seem as familiar as if we'd been born there. Others remain stubbornly and inexplicably alien. It took me many years to begin clearly to visualise Dublin and its inhabitants, and William Faulkner's, now here I've typed out a word I cannot possibly pronounce, but it's spelled Yoknapawha, county. How you pronounce it I've never known, because we weren't taught Faulkner here. And that very word was a mystery to me, until I bullied two young feminist academics from the University of Southern Mississippi, which I was visiting, to take me for a ride in a paddle steamer along the wide brown river. They couldn't think why I wanted to go to the places I wanted to go to. They wanted to take me to the nightlife of New Orleans. Through fiction, we may explore our experience and our imaginations, and advance and enlarge our concepts of how best we may live. This weekend we're talking about women in the novel, so I'll concentrate on how women writers have taught me so much of what I know, and on the way in which, through writing my own fiction, I had a sense of creating a future for myself, a future that could never have existed for me if I hadn't discovered this way of making maps and blueprints. And this future is now the present that we all inhabit. And some of this future was then and is now specifically female, which is appropriate to talk about in a women's college. There were several key works that opened up the future for me and which taught me things both trivial and profound. And the novel, as we all know, is wonderfully adapted to mixing the trivial and the profound. Here at Cambridge, in the 50s and 60s, we studied the great tradition, which included several women writers. Jane Austen, the Brontes, George Eliot were allowed. Virginia Woolf had not then been admitted to the mainstream in Newnham or in Cambridge, despite Newnham's connections with the classic feminist address, which became a room of one's own. But women writers were not absent from our studies, and looking back, I seem to remember a very interesting feminist light that Jean Gooder shed upon our studies of Greek tragedy. She may have forgotten it, but I remember it well. It was connected with the Furies. It wasn't, however, until after I left Cambridge in 1960 that I encountered three important novels which provided an education beyond the range of any known syllabus. These three were all published in the early 1960s, and that's when I read them, though I didn't read them in chronological order. Doris Lessing's The Golden Notebook appeared in 1962, and Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar and Mary McCarthy's The Group both appeared in 1963. I had already started writing fiction myself by then, as my first novel was also published in 1963, so it must have been written not long before I came across any of these titles. But I did start writing before I discovered them, and in fact the last I read of those three was The Golden Notebook, which I know I didn't read until I'd published myself 4 novels, because I remember writing a fan letter to Doris Lessing saying rather timidly but boastfully that I was a published author and I didn't want her help in getting published, but I did rather need her help in learning how to lead my life. She responded very generously to this appeal. None of these 3 novelists, Lessing, Plath and Mary McCarthy, was British born. although by the 60s Lessing had been living in England for some time, and Plath, as you know, was partly educated here in Cambridge. Plath was profoundly influenced by her English experiences and made her short adult life in this country, in London and in Devon. Her only novel, The Bell Jar, is set in Boston and Manhattan. Mary McCarthy's The Group is set largely in New York, though with a much wider geographical reach. And The Golden Notebook devotes large sections to Lessing's year in southern Rhodesia and South Africa. But none of these novels seemed in any way alien to me as a young reader in my 20s. They spoke to me directly about a world which I didn't know firsthand, but which I knew was there and ready to be discovered. I trusted their reports completely. The Group by Mary McCarthy is less read now than the other two novels I've mentioned, and is perhaps more specific and therefore more limited in its range of references. But at the time when it was first published, it burst upon us as a revelation. It shocked the journalistic and literary establishment. I see that the Oxford Companion to English Literature says, "It caused some stir when published in England because of its frank descriptions of contraception, breastfeeding, and so on." An interesting evasive phrase, that "and so on." I wonder if I wrote it. Some stir is an understatement. The Group was as sensational in its day as Lolita, and it was published by the same bold publisher, George Weidenfeld. It was threatened with prosecution under the Obscene Publications Act and read avidly when it appeared by those of us who were searching desperately for reliable forms of contraception and couldn't find out much about them from any other source. We learnt from this novel about contraception, about breastfeeding, about bottle feeding, about babies, about men, marriages, infidelities, psychoanalysis, communism, American college life. The Vassar of the novel was not so unlike Newnham after all. And we learned how to make easy meals from detailed recipes which you could follow ingredient by ingredient if you wished. This was much more useful to us than reading Lady Chatterley's Lover, which didn't appear in its full text until 1960, and from which you couldn't learn much at all about how to live, cook, work, pursue a career, and have babies in the 1960s. Learning about cooking from fiction and memoirs is one of my minor pleasures. I learned the correct way to cut carrots from an Edna O'Brien novel. You do them in little batons and not in ring slices. I learnt about omelettes from Gertrude Stein's The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, which, if I remember rightly, tells us that fried eggs for an unexpected guest are all very well, but in her resounding phrase, an omelette shows more respect. Plath tells us how garlic salt can improve scrambled eggs. Iris Murdoch slightly lets the culinary side down by the extraordinary recipes attributed to her protagonist in her novel The Sea, the Sea. I remember boiled onions, treacle tart, Vesta curry mixed with surprise peas out of a packet. I'm sure some of you remember Vesta curry and surprise peas. But these weren't really her own ideas. They were all, as her husband John Bailey once told me proudly, invented by him. They were what they lived on, and he thought they were all delicious. I can hardly resist reading out to you some of the recipe hints from The Group, and I'm not going to resist, I'm going to read you one or two, which I found peculiarly fascinating when I was learning to cook myself. I loved the way that Mary McCarthy elevated cooking from dullness to a sociological subject fraught with wider meanings. Many of the recipes included canned beans, and there is a sad description of a failed baked Alaska. Now, I am going to read you one or two of these wonderful recipes. This is Kay, one of the group's characters, who is being taught to cook by her husband Harold. His specialities were Italian spaghetti, which any beginner could learn, and those minced sea clams, and meatballs cooked in salt in a hot skillet, and a quick and easy meatloaf his mother had taught him. 1 part beef, 1 part pork, 1 part veal. Add sliced onions, pour over it a can of Campbell's tomato soup and bake in the oven. Then there was his chili con carne made with canned kidney beans, tomato soup again, and onions again, and half a pound of hamburger. You could serve that over rice, and it stretched to 6 people. There are other wonderful descriptions of the green goddess jellied salad with lime, gelatins, shrimps, mayonnaise and alligator pear. I don't know what an alligator pear is. And beans again. New ways of fixing canned beans. You just add catsup and mustard and Worcestershire sauce, sprinkle them with plenty of brown sugar, cover them with bacon and put them in the oven in a Pyrex dish. It sounds terribly good, said Dottie, but Daddy would die. There's also an aria to the iceberg lettuce, telling you that once you've tried the iceberg so crisp and fresh, you'll never want to see the old Boston lettuce again. There is cooking in the Golden Notebook too, as well as sexuality, motherhood, madness, and an embattled struggle to define and discover the nature of and threats to female independence and freedom. There's a memorable veal escalope with mushrooms and sour cream, which Anna Wolfe prepares for her lover, who never turns up to eat it, and we know that that is the beginning of the end of that relationship. The Golden Notebook is in its way a novel of midlife crisis in which a mature and experienced woman, sexually and politically experienced, assesses her past and confronts and creates her future. The Bell Jar, in contrast, is what we now call a debut novel, full of ruthless girlish discovery and reckless first-time events. A first encounter with a finger bowl, a first vodka, a first sexual encounter, a first view of a baby being born, a first bout of crab poisoning, a first fearless and near-fatal run down a ski slope, a first suicide attempt, and a first attempt at writing a novel. Sylvia Plath took the world on very courageously. Just a little aside on the finger bowl. I'm sure some of you will remember the scene in The Bell Jar where our young ingénue Esther starts to drink the water out of her finger bowl and eat the flowers in it. Well, I was amused this morning. I suddenly remembered there was a finger bowl in Mary McCarthy, and with the wonderful aid of the Kindle search programme, I was able to find that there is indeed a description of a finger bowl in a very beautiful house in Cleveland where everything is done in the English style. So obviously the finger bowl was a diagnostic moment in many young women's lives. Your first encounter was like your first encounter with other more serious matters. The Bell Jar is an astonishingly bold and confident and dangerous piece of work, and it's informed throughout by the narrator's determination never to become a married female doormat. I gathered quotes from all 3 of these novels, and I cherished them and carried them with me and imparted them to sixth forms up and down the land when I was invited to give talks about the novel. From the Golden Notebook, one of my most important passages describes the narrator Anna Wolfe imagining her fictional counterpart Ella and picturing how much better Ella might deal with her, Anna's, real-life lover Saul. Ella, the fictional character, would be cooler, more intelligent, she imagines. And then, I quote, "After a while I realised I was doing what I had done before, creating the third, the woman altogether better than I was. For I could positively mark the point where Ella left reality, left how she would in fact behave because of her nature, and move into a large generosity of personality impossible to her. But I didn't dislike this new person I was creating. I was thinking that quite possibly these marvellous, generous things we walk side by side with in our imaginations could come into our existence simply because we need them, because we imagine them. And later on, she recounts these thoughts to her lover Saul, who responds to her doubts by saying, "We're going to be saved by what we put on our agendas. We've got to believe in our beautiful, impossible blueprints." And that is a quotation I've held very close to my heart. Place the Beljar is studded with notes of defiance and assertion which struck a deep chord with my generation, of which one of my favourites describes narrator's Esther's determination not to dwindle into a wife, like her official beau's mother, Mrs. Willard. Esther says, "I tried to imagine what it would be like if Constantine was my husband. It would mean getting up at 7 and cooking him eggs and bacon and coffee and dawdling around in my nightgown and curlers after he'd left for work to wash up the dirty plates and make the bed. And then when he came home from a lively, fascinating day, he'd expect a big dinner, and I'd spend the evening washing up even more dirty plates until I fell into bed utterly exhausted. That seemed a dreary and wasted life for a girl with 15 years of straight A's. But I knew that's what marriage was like, because cook and clean was just what Buddy Willard's mother did from morning to night. And she was the wife of a university professor and had been a private school teacher herself. Once I found Mrs. Willard braiding a rug out of strips of wool from Mr. Willard's old suits. She'd spent weeks on that rug, and I had admired the tweedy browns and greens and blues. But after Mrs. Willard was through, instead of hanging the rug on the wall the way I would have done, she put it down in place of her kitchen mat. And in a few days it was soiled and dull and indistinguishable from any mat you could buy for under $1 at the 5 and 10. And I knew that in spite of all the roses and kisses and restaurant dinners a man showered on a woman before he married her, what he secretly wanted when the wedding service ended was her to flatten out under his feet like Mrs. Willard's kitchen mat. I also remembered Buddy Willard saying that when I had children I wouldn't want to write poems anymore, so I began to think that maybe it was true that when you were married and had children it was like being brainwashed, and afterwards you went round as numb as a slave in some private totalitarian state. It's the most brilliant quotation. And as we know, things began to change rapidly from then on. Not all my learning about how women lived in the 50s and 60s came from women writers, actually. I mean, I did learn quite a bit or two from Alan Sillitoe, and those of you who read Saturday Night and Sunday Morning will remember his rather dangerous advice on how to procure an abortion by getting you into a very, very hot bath and drinking a bottle of gin, a scene which I recreated in my novel The Millstone, where it had no effect on the would-be mother at all. She had the baby and was very pleased about it. So you can learn things from men as well as from women. But it was at this period in the early 60s that I began tentatively to explore my own future through the lives of my protagonists, pushing them out before me into the world to see how they would fare, what choices they would dare to make. Some of them were braver than me. Some of them had larger careers than me. Finding careers for fictitious female characters was in itself an exploration, bringing one up sharply against the realities of the world of employment and possibility and verisimilitude. Writing, of course, as George Eliot and Woolf had pointed out, had long been a viable career for women, but there seemed to me something solipsistic about making all one's characters writers, even though Lessing and Plath had done so in 2 of my 3 key formative texts. So I had to look elsewhere, and this in itself was illuminating and enlarging. Some professions seemed to me to be beyond imagining, but I embarked on research for a female archaeologist with alacrity and much pleasure and profit. Newnham, as we know, has several distinguished, internationally renowned archaeologists amongst its alumni, so I haven't strayed too far here from my known or imaginable world, and it was a field in which success was possible. Slightly embarrassed to record that I actually had archaeologists in 2 of my novels, and on the first occasion I was advised to write to Professor Barry Cunliffe for advice about career structure, And he replied very politely. And then many, many years later, completely having forgotten I'd written to him, I wrote to him again about whether you could do archaeology as a separate degree in Oxford or whether... Anyway, and he wrote back and said, you've asked me this question before. And then terrible embarrassment overcame me because I never sent him a copy of my novels because I was embarrassed by my novels. I mean, I didn't think they were worthy of a proper archaeologist. And maybe I should go home and send them to you. Now he's still there. Anyway, in my novels, I did want my characters to have active lives and not to be Mrs. Willard-style doormats. I greatly admire Anita Bruckner's novels, which continue to describe the contemporary world with accuracy and style. But there is something discouraging about the succession of lonely, ageing, underemployed spinsters that people her work. She herself is an art historian of international distinction, as well as a highly successful novelist, but she doesn't allow many of her characters a profitable or even interesting career. In fact, when we look back at the group, which although published in the 60s, looks back to McCarthy's own youth and the class of 1933, we note that many of the new graduates of her group were way ahead of Anita Bruckner's characters in their expectations. These privileged, highly educated, free-thinking women were embarking on work in publishing, teaching, social work, medicine and the theatre, and they knew girls of perfectly good background who were going into business, anthropology, medicine, not because they had to, but because they knew they had something to contribute to our emergent America. The Second World War, as we now appreciate, set women back and delayed progress and emancipation, but the seeds of ambition were there in McCarthy's 1933. And on another historical note, I now see McCarthy as the heir to Edith